Hey, and welcome to our first ever episode of Ghost Biographies, yet another mini-series here on the channel where we explore the forgotten lives of people from throughout history. And, just in time for Spooky Month, we're headed to Hungary to cover someone from the noble Bathory family. Her name is Elizabeth, but she's more often known by another name, the Blood Countess. Born on August 7th, 1560, Elizabeth from a very young age devoted herself to study, most notably languages including Latin, German, Hungarian, and Greek. Her family, the Bathory, were quite influential and prestigious in Hungary, one of them being Stephen Bathory, who you might remember from our Wallachia episode. If not, see the link above me. Anyway, as was the case with most children from noble families, especially girls, Elizabeth had to marry rather early. At just 14 years of age, she married Ferenc Nadasdy, one of the wealthiest and most influential men in Hungary at the time. That being said, he was just 19 years old at the time of their marriage. The Nadasdy, however, were a family of a similar level of prestige to that of the Bathory. The newly married couple went to live in Cachtice Castle near the village of Cheta in what is today Slovakia. The castle itself and 14 surrounding villages were a dowry from the two noble families, which, seems a lot better than a toaster if you ask me. Anyway, taking a step off my soapbox, it was around this time that Elizabeth also converted to Protestantism as well. Over the following years, her husband gained some renown for his abilities as a military commander, leading a flank of the Hungarian army and fighting alongside other Hungarian noblemen against the dreaded Ottomans. This was especially true during the so-called Long Turkish War, fought between 1593 and 1606. But what exactly was going on here? Well, the region found itself in a not enviable position, being sandwiched between the Ottomans and the Hapsburg sphere of influence, so perhaps a bit of historical context is necessary. Who exactly were the Hapsburg, you ask? Well, the Hapsburg were probably the most influential European dynasty of the early modern age. They ruled the Archduchy of Austria, and many would serve as the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. After 1526, members of the Hapsburg also held the title King of Royal Hungary. The Kingdom of Hungary ceased to exist in 1541 and rather was split into three parts, two of which belonged to the Ottomans. Okay, so who were the Ottomans? Thought to be the descendants of nomadic tribes originally from Central Asia, the Ottomans first established themselves in Asia Minor, then pushed into the Balkans, and in 1453 even managed to conquer Constantinople. Many Christians, the Ottomans being an encroaching Muslim power, saw them as an existential threat, and shortly before our story takes place, they had even besieged Vienna, unsuccessfully, in 1529. Alright. The castle of Bathory Nadasdy was located in Royal Hungary, a Hapsburg territory. Conflict with the Ottomans was rather commonplace, which meant the Countess's husband, Ferenc, a military commander, was frequently not at home. Kind of a side note here, but he soon gained an awesome nickname, the Black Knight. Ferenc Nadasdy, the Black Knight. Yeah, that's pretty cool, as far as historical nicknames go anyway. Longshanks. Ferenc soon gained more renown for a series of battles and conquests in which he played an instrumental role, his bravery in face and cruelty towards the Ottomans becoming known throughout Hungary. It was also said that he, liked to torture prisoners, so there's that. All of this meant Elizabeth was often alone at home, and rather uncommon for the period of time, the couple's first child was born after more than 10 years of marriage. But in 1604, the Black Knight, who many believed to be indestructible, died in battle. His death, however, was not by the sword, spear, or arrow, but rather from a mysterious disease. Historians still don't know exactly what it was, but Ferenc reportedly suffered a disease of the lower limbs for around 2 years before succumbing to said illness. Everything that Ferenc possessed was thereafter inherited by Elizabeth, and then, just a year later, her brother passed away, leaving her a modest fortune and several properties. In effect, she became quite independently wealthy. And following this, there was a 5-year period where Elizabeth just sort of kept to herself. She probably was just enjoying the fruits of her, newfound wealth, right? Or grieving the loss of her husband. Well, some had their doubts about this. On December 29, 1610, Count Gyorgy Thurzo, Palatine of Hungary, stormed into her castle with his men because certain accusations had been levied against Elizabeth, and it was no less than the King of Hungary who ordered Thurzo himself to enter her residence. According to Thurzo, upon entering the castle, he found the horribly mutilated corpse of a young woman and what he later described as a still living prey girl. It was also later claimed that he found Elizabeth in the act of letting a recently deceased girl bleed out, although this is contradicted by later statements that Thurzo entered the castle when Elizabeth was having her dinner. Either way, Elizabeth was promptly arrested, and soon a twisted story began to emerge in which it was claimed she tortured and killed dozens of women and girls from the nearby village over a period of several years. A trial soon followed in which Elizabeth's servants corroborated the official narrative. All the while, Elizabeth herself was to be confined in the castle, where she later was allegedly locked in a room, its doorway bricked up aside from a small hole for communication and the delivery of meals. During the trial, it was claimed that Elizabeth had killed somewhere between 80 to 650 people, the precise number being unknown and subject to much controversy even today. Her servants, despite their testimony, were not completely innocent as far as the court was concerned. 2 of them had their fingertips removed, while another was beheaded, his corpse then burned. Reportedly, they had aided Elizabeth in her crimes, which included whipping victims to death, cutting them with scissors and knives, throwing boiling water upon them, burning or otherwise mutilating their hands, and dousing them in cold water and then confining them outside in freezing temperatures. Most of these accusations, including those against Elizabeth herself, however, cannot be proven definitively, and in more than one instance were obtained by the court through means of torture. That being said, the sheer amount of witnesses, some 300 of them, alongside physical evidence in the presence of dead or dying victims in the castle, support claims of Elizabeth being one of history's most prolific female serial killers. According to testimony, Elizabeth's first victims were village girls aged 10 to 14 years. She is then said to have moved on to the daughters of the lesser gentry, sent to the castle to learn courtly etiquette. Abductions were also alleged to have occurred intermittently. Now, don't forget, during this period of time, the nobility held a massive amount of power, and Elizabeth seemed in particular to target women and girls from classes lower than her own, meaning little would come from accusations of their mistreatment and/or disappearance. And honestly, that's not very different from the modus operandi of most modern serial killers, like Anthony Sowell, the so-called Cleveland Strangler, and the still as of yet unidentified Long Island serial killer. This also went both ways though, meaning when charges were levied against Elizabeth by the powers that be, she stood very little chance of a fair trial. Often, when a nobleman or noblewoman wanted to get rid of you, they just simply had to make up charges and didn't really need to be super detailed. So the fact that we have around 300 witnesses and physical evidence seems a bit much if this were just another case of fabricated charges. There, moreover, were rumors of her crimes circulating as far back as 1602 and 1604, roughly 8 years before she was arrested, yet the royal court did not act. One reason why some people argue that she was actually innocent, however, was the long-standing rivalry between the Hapsburg and Bathory, meaning this may have been a purge against the latter. It's also worth noting that most witnesses in the trial claimed they had merely heard of Elizabeth's crimes from others, but did not personally witness them. Not even one letter of accusation was written to the king by locals, and that is kind of strange considering the crime. Anyway, Elizabeth, who was found guilty, was not executed, but rather spent the remainder of her life, about 4 years, under house arrest, allegedly sealed in a bedchamber. Although other sources do indicate she was able to move freely about the castle. Either way, it seems it was originally planned for her to be sent to a nunnery, but as tales of her crimes against the daughters of the lesser nobility spread, this became not a viable course of action. The Holy Roman Emperor, Matthias, actually pushed for her execution, but his advisors warned him against this, fearful of destabilizing Royal Hungary. On November 20th, 1614, Elizabeth complained to a bodyguard about her hands feeling cold. He replied, "It's nothing, mistress, just go lie down." She went to sleep and was found dead early the following morning. Thereafter, she was to be buried in a nearby church, but according to some historical sources, the locals strongly opposed her burial in Cette. So, rather, the Countess was brought to Eched, where her family was originally from, and was buried inside the Bathory Family crypt. Over time, more than likely fictional rumors began to spread about Elizabeth and her crimes. For example, some have claimed she practiced cannibalism and bathed in the blood of her victims to maintain her youth. There were also claims that she covered her victims in honey, bearing them up to their shoulders near anthills. The number of people she allegedly killed rose as well, but it bears repeating, many of these claims appeared years after her death. Elizabeth would also, in death, gain a series of nicknames, including the Blood Countess and Countess Dracula, in reference to her alleged vampiric activities. Even today, Elizabeth Bathory continues to influence popular culture, with a character in Fate Grand Order being named after the Hungarian noblewoman. And what's more, Tomonori Takano, Resident Evil Village's art director, revealed that, in part, Lady Dimitrescu was inspired by the Countess, alongside Morticia Addams and the Japanese urban legend Hashaku-sama. And that about does it. Thank you for watching this, premiere episode of Ghost Biographies here on Ghost Countries. So what do you guys think? Was Elizabeth really guilty of the crimes she was accused of, or was she innocent and this was merely some political purge meant to, weaken and remove a very wealthy, independent woman who was part of the Bathory family, which, as we mentioned, there was that rivalry with the Hapsburgs. Anyway, let us know your thoughts down below, and if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to the channel, give this a like, and we'll see you again next time. Peace!